In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 alien civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that echoes through every star system, every trading post, every military academy from the core worlds to the outer rim. Never underestimate the humans, and more importantly, never abandon those who choose to stand with them. This is not a story about humanity's conquest of the stars. It's not about superior technology or overwhelming firepower. This is about something far more dangerous, far more powerful than any weapon ever forged. The unbreakable bond that forms when different species choose to fight side by side, and how that bond can reshape the very fabric of galactic civilization. When the Zephyrian Empire, masters of 100 worlds, declared humanity a plague to be cleansed from the galaxy, they expected quick compliance from the lesser species under their dominion. What they got instead was the greatest shock in their 1,000-year history. Entire alien civilizations willing to face annihilation rather than betray their human allies. The Empire had conquered through fear and overwhelming force for millennia. They had never encountered anything like this before. Loyalty that transcended species, courage that spread like wildfire across the galaxy, and a human capacity for inspiring others that would ultimately prove more devastating than any battle fleet. This is the story of how respect is earned not through domination, but through sacrifice. How bonds forged in the crucible of war become stronger than any chain of command, and how sometimes the greatest victories are won not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who inspire others to fight beside them. The holographic display flickered to life in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, casting an ominous blue glow across the faces of representatives from 47 different species. Admiral Zexay of the Zephyrian Empire stood 12 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like polished obsidian. Forearms gesticulating with practiced authority as his message played across every screen in known space. Beings of the galaxy, his voice resonated with the harmonic undertones that had commanded respect for over 1,000 years. The time for tolerance has ended. The human infestation spreads like a plague across our sacred cosmos, corrupting the natural order that has maintained peace and prosperity for millennia. Their chaotic nature, their unpredictable emotions, their dangerous tendency to form inappropriate bonds across species lines. These traits threaten the very foundation of galactic civilization. In the human delegation section, Commander Sarah Chen sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on the massive alien addressing the assembly. Her jaw was set in a line that her crew would recognize as dangerous, but she made no move to interrupt. Around the chamber, she could feel the weight of dozens of alien gazers, some sympathetic, others calculating, many simply afraid. Therefore, Admiral Zexay continued, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. By unanimous decree of the Zephyrian High Command, all member species of this council are hereby ordered to cease all diplomatic, military, and economic relations with humanity. Any government, organization, or individual found providing aid, comfort, or assistance to human entities will be considered enemies of the Empire and dealt with accordingly.
The chamber erupted in chaos.
The delegate from Proxima 7, a tall, graceful being with silver skin and large violet eyes, shot to her feet. You cannot simply dictate policy to sovereign worlds, Admiral. The Andromedans have had peaceful relations with humanity for over 3 decades.
And that, Zexay replied, his voice cutting through the commotion like a blade, is precisely why the Andromedans will be the first to demonstrate their loyalty to the Empire.
You have 72 standard hours to expel all human presence from your territory. Failure to comply will result in immediate military action. Commander Chen finally stood, her movement causing a ripple of silence to spread outward from her position. At average human height, she was dwarfed by most of the beings in the chamber, but something in her bearing commanded attention. Admiral Zexay, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the vast space. With respect, I believe you may have miscalculated. The Zephyrian's compound eyes focused on her with laser intensity. Explain yourself, human. You're operating under the assumption that fear of your empire is stronger than the bonds we've built with our allies over the past century. You believe that when forced to choose between their friendship with humanity and their fear of your retaliation, they'll abandon us. Sarah's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I think you're about to learn something new about both humanity and our friends. A low rumble emanated from Zexay's throat, the Zephyrian equivalent of laughter.
Your optimism is touching but misplaced.
Observe. He gestured toward the viewing screen, which now displayed a tactical map of the galaxy. Red markers indicated Zephyrian military positions, an overwhelming concentration of force that stretched across dozens of star systems. The Empire commands a fleet of over 10,000 vessels, ground forces numbering in the billions, and planetary defense systems that could sterilize entire worlds. What can humanity offer that could possibly compete with that? Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Perhaps I can answer that. All eyes turned to see Thrakmor, the Krillian ambassador, rising from his seat. The 7-foot-tall reptilian was considered one of the most pragmatic voices in the Council. His species had survived 3 major galactic wars by carefully choosing the winning side. His words carried significant weight.
Admiral Zexai, Thrakmor said, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. You speak of military might and planetary defenses. These are indeed impressive. But you seem to have forgotten what happened during the Scarab incursion 40 years ago. The chamber fell deathly quiet.
The Scarab incursion was still a painful memory for many species, an invasion by extragalactic entities that had nearly broken the back of galactic civilization before being repelled. When my homeworld of Krylos was overrun, Thrakmor continued, when our defense fleet was scattered and our people faced extinction, it wasn't the mighty Zephyrian Empire that answered our distress call. There was a single human frigate, the UES Defiance, carrying a crew of barely 200 beings.
Sarah felt a tightness in her chest.
She knew this story, had grown up hearing about Captain Maria Santos and her crew. They could have jumped to safety, Thrakmor said, his voice growing stronger.
They could have reported our situation to the proper authorities and waited for a proper rescue fleet. Instead, they chose to engage a Scarab dreadnought 15 times their size, holding the line for 6 hours while civilian transports evacuated our major population centers.
They saved over 2 million Krillian lives that day. The reptilian ambassador's eyes found Sarah's across the chamber. Captain Santos and her crew didn't survive the battle, but their sacrifice wasn't just about saving Krillian lives. It was about proving that in the darkest moments, some beings will choose to stand together regardless of the cost. That lesson has shaped Krillian policy ever since. Admiral Zexai's mandibles clicked with irritation. Ancient history and sentiment will not protect you from modern reality, Ambassador. The Empire's patience has limits. As does our fear, came a new voice. Ambassador Veltar of the Nexus Collective had remained silent until now. The floating, energy-based being pulsed with agitated light as they spoke. My people exist as pure consciousness within quantum matrices. We have no physical form that your weapons can threaten, no planets that your fleets can bombard. Yet we too have experienced what it means to fight alongside humanity. The collective ambassador's form brightened as they accessed old data files. When our primary server cluster was infected with the Void virus 3 decades ago, threatening to erase our entire civilization, it was human cybernetics specialists who volunteered to enter our quantum space directly. 7 humans allowed their consciousness to be digitized and uploaded into our most secure networks to battle the virus from within. Sarah remembered this too. The volunteers had known that the process was irreversible. They would never return to physical form. Yet they had volunteered anyway. 3 of those humans still exist within our networks, Veltar continued. They chose permanent exile from their physical existence to save our species. That is not a debt that can be dismissed by imperial decree. Across the chamber, similar murmurs were beginning to rise. The hegemony representative was whispering urgently to her aide about the human agricultural specialists who had prevented famine on 17 hegemony worlds. The Towery delegate was nodding grimly, no doubt thinking about the human peacekeeping force that had ended the brutal civil war that had torn his planet apart for a generation. Admiral Zexai's composure was beginning to crack. You speak of individual acts of heroism as if they represent policy. Sentiment is not strategy. When our fleets arrive at your borders, these pleasant memories will not shield you from plasma fire. Perhaps not, said a calm voice from the back of the chamber.
Every being present turned to stare in shock at the speaker, Ambassador Corinth of the Ethereal Dominion, the most reclusive and militarily powerful species in the known galaxy.
The Ethereals almost never spoke in council sessions, preferring to observe and occasionally cast tie-breaking votes. Corinth was tall and graceful, with translucent skin that showed the movement of bioluminescent orbits beneath. When the Ethereals chose to engage militarily, entire civilizations simply vanished. Their technology was so advanced that most species couldn't even comprehend how their weapons worked. Admiral Zexai, Corinth said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple dimensions. The Dominion has remained neutral in galactic politics for over 5,000 years. We have watched civilizations rise and fall, observed the ebb and flow of power across the cosmos, and learned to distinguish between those who command through fear and those who inspire through example. The chamber was so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support system seemed loud by comparison. 60 years ago, during the dark matter crisis, our homeworld's reality matrix began destabilizing. Our greatest scientists predicted total dimensional collapse within standard months. The phenomenon was beyond our ability to control or even fully understand. A cascade failure in the fundamental structure of space-time around our star system. Sarah had never heard this story. Few beings had. The ethereals were notoriously secretive about their internal affairs. We sent distress signals across the galaxy, requesting any theoretical assistance from allied civilizations. Most responses were sympathetic, but ultimately useless. Few species possessed the scientific knowledge to even comprehend our problem. The Zephyrian Empire offered to relocate our population to tributary worlds under their protection, which would have meant abandoning our ancient homeworld and accepting vassal status. Corinth's bioluminescent organs pulsed slowly as they continued. Then we received a transmission from Earth. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a human theoretical physicist, claimed that while she couldn't solve our problem, she might be able to slow the collapse long enough for us to develop a solution ourselves. Sarah's breath caught. Rebecca Chen was her grandmother, a woman she had never met but whose reputation in xenophysics was legendary. Dr. Chen and a team of 12 humans arrived at our homeworld knowing that exposure to our destabilized reality matrix would be fatal to their neural systems within days. They worked for 47 consecutive hours without rest, developing a harmonics-based field generator that could temporarily stabilize localized space-time distortions. The ethereal ambassador paused, their form growing brighter. Their device bought us 18 additional months, enough time for our scientists to develop a permanent solution. All 13 humans died from dimensional exposure syndrome within a week of the field generator's activation. They knew this would happen. They came anyway. The chamber remained silent as Corinth's gaze swept across the assembly, finally settling on Admiral Zek-Sahai. The ethereal dominion has never forgotten this sacrifice. While we do not typically involve ourselves in galactic politics, we make exceptions for matters involving those who have proven themselves worthy of our friendship. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The ethereal dominion possessed weapons that could turn Zephyrian dreadnoughts into quantum mist without ever appearing on sensors. If they chose to involve themselves in this conflict, the balance of power would shift dramatically. Admiral Zexer's forearms trembled with barely controlled rage. You would all risk everything, your worlds, your populations, your civilizations, for the sake of human allies who may not even survive the coming storm? You still don't understand, Sarah said quietly, but her voice somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. This isn't about risking everything for humanity. This is about refusing to abandon the principles that make civilization worth preserving. You see weakness in our alliances because you can only think in terms of domination and submission. But these relationships aren't based on fear or calculation. They're based on trust, earned through actions when actions mattered most. She gestured toward the assembled delegates. Every species in this room has had to make hard choices, face difficult moments when survival seemed uncertain. And in many of those moments, they found humans willing to stand beside them, not because of treaties or trade agreements, but because it was the right thing to do. That's not weakness, Admiral. That's the foundation of something stronger than any empire. The Zephyrian commander's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. 72 hours, he repeated. When that time expires, the Empire will demonstrate the futility of your romantic idealism. We have conquered 100 worlds through strength and discipline. Your emotional attachments will crumble when faced with the reality of superior force. As the hologram flickered out, leaving the chamber in relative darkness, Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw fear there, certainly. Any rational being would be afraid of the Zephyrian war machine. But she also saw something else. Something that Admiral Zek-Sahai had failed to recognize or understand. Determination. The Andromedans were conferring in rapid musical tones. The Krylians were accessing military databases. The ethereals were simply sitting in contemplative silence, their forms pulsing with slow, thoughtful light. Across the chamber, representatives from dozens of species were making similar preparations. In 72 hours, the galaxy would discover whether bonds forged in trust and sacrifice could stand against the cold mathematics of imperial power. But as Sarah watched her allies prepare for what might be the fight of their lives, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The Zephyrian Empire was about to learn that they had made two critical errors in their calculations. First, they had assumed that fear would triumph over loyalty. Second, and perhaps more importantly, They had given their enemies 3 days to prepare for war. 3 days, it would turn out, was more than enough time for something unprecedented in galactic history to begin taking shape, not just an alliance of convenience, but a coalition of species willing to fight and die for principles that transcended mere survival. The Empire was about to face something they had never encountered before, an enemy that refused to be intimidated because they were fighting for something more important than their own lives. As the council chamber began to empty, species representatives hurrying back to their ships to carry word to their homeworlds, Sarah remained in her seat for a moment longer. She thought about her grandmother, Rebecca, about Captain Santos and her crew, about all the humans who had made the choices that led to this moment. They had never sought to build an empire or dominate other species. They had simply tried to do what was right when doing right was difficult. Now it remained to be seen whether that approach to galactic citizenship could survive its greatest test. In 72 hours, the shooting would begin. But the real battle, the contest between fear and trust, between domination and cooperation, had already started. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The bridge of the UES Defiant hummed with controlled energy as Commander Sarah Chen surveyed the tactical display that dominated the center of the command deck. 24 hours before the Zephyrian Empire's deadline, the space around Andromeda Prime had transformed into the largest gathering of starships in galactic history. The display showed over 300 vessels from 14 different species, their formations creating a defensive perimeter that stretched across half the star system. "Status report," Sarah called to her communications officer, Lieutenant Torres, whose fingers danced across holographic controls as she managed dozens of simultaneous conversations with Allied fleet commanders. "Admiral Chen," Torres said, unconsciously promoting her commander in recognition of her new role coordinating the Allied response. "Final ship counts are coming in. The Krillian battle group arrived 2 hours ago with 16 vessels. The Draconian Imperium fleet just dropped out of hyperspace with 28 ships, including their flagship dreadnought, Vengeance of Honor," Sarah nodded, watching as the massive Draconian vessels took their assigned positions in the defensive formation. The Draconians built their ships for one purpose: devastating close-range combat. Their vessels were heavily armored, bristling with weapons, and crewed by warriors who viewed retreat as a personal disgrace. Having them as allies significantly improved the Allied fleet's chances in a direct engagement. The Hegemony Second Fleet is maintaining position at coordinate 77 Alpha with 41 ships, Torres continued. Tauri Defense Force has contributed 18 vessels, including their hospital ships for medical support. The Free Traders Coalition sent 32 armed merchant vessels, and they've volunteered to handle supply runs between our ships during the battle. The diversity of the Allied fleet was staggering. Sleek Andromedian cruisers with their distinctive crystalline hulls flew alongside bulky Krillian warships covered in ablative armor plating. The energy beings of the Nexus Collective had contributed 7 ships that seemed to be made of pure light. Their weapon systems based on controlled quantum fluctuations that could disrupt enemy targeting systems. Even the normally peaceful Harmony Foundation had sent 12 ships equipped with advanced medical bays and rescue equipment. But perhaps most impressive was the single vessel that hung at the center of the formation like a star among planets, the ethereal ship EDS Harmony. The vessel defied conventional understanding of starship design. It appeared to be made of some kind of crystalline material that shifted between different states of matter, sometimes solid, sometimes gaseous, sometimes existing as pure energy. Sensors could barely get a lock on it, and Sarah suspected that was intentional. "Any word from Subcommander Velnara?" Sarah asked. "The Harmony has been running system checks on their defensive matrix generator," Torres replied. "Subcommander Velnara reports that they can extend protective barriers to cover approximately 70% of our fleet during the initial engagement. She recommends that our most vulnerable ships take positions within the matrix perimeter." Sarah studied the tactical display, calculating firing arcs and defensive positions. The Allied fleet was impressive, but it was also a logistical nightmare. Ships from different species used different communication protocols, operated under different military doctrines, and had varying levels of training and experience. Coordinating their efforts would be like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians had never seen sheet music. "Incoming transmission from Prime Minister Lysandra," announced the communications console. The holographic display shifted to show the Andromedian leader standing in her planet's orbital defense center. Behind her, Sarah could see the massive planetary shield generators that protected Andromeda Prime's surface from orbital bombardment. The shields could withstand significant punishment, but they weren't designed to handle the firepower that 400 Zephyrian vessels could deliver. "Commander Chen," Lysandra said, Our long-range sensors have detected the Zephyrian fleet. They'll be dropping out of hyperspace in approximately 18 hours. Admiral HFY is commanding from the Empire flagship Dominion of Worlds, supported by 8 other Dreadnought-class vessels.
Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. 9 Zephyrian dreadnoughts represented more firepower than most species possessed in their entire naval forces. Each vessel carried enough weapons to devastate a planet's surface and enough armor to shrug off attacks that would cripple lesser ships. "Prime Minister," Sarah replied, "we need to discuss evacuation procedures.
Even with our allied fleet, the odds of successfully defending your system are not favorable. We should begin moving non-combatants to safety while we still can." Lysandra's violet eyes flashed with determination. "Commander, we've had this conversation before. The Andromedian people have voted to stand and fight. However, we have accepted the ethereal offer to evacuate our children to their dimensional sanctuaries. Adult civilians who choose to remain will be moved to our deepest underground shelters." Before Sarah could respond, her tactical officer called out, "Ma'am, we're receiving an urgent transmission from the perimeter scout ships. They're detecting additional hyperspace distortions, but the signatures don't match Zephyrian drive systems." The main display shifted to show data from the long-range sensor network. Sarah studied the readings with growing confusion. The sensor signatures were definitely artificial, clearly starships rather than natural phenomena. But they didn't match any known drive technology in the Imperial database. "Communication coming in on standard diplomatic frequencies," Torres announced. "Unknown vessels are requesting permission to join the Allied formation." "Put it through," Sarah ordered, wondering what other surprises this conflict would produce. The holographic display activated to reveal a figure that made Sarah's breath catch. Standing before them was a tall, imposing being with deep blue skin, forearms, and the distinctive cranial ridges of a Zephyrian. But this wasn't Admiral HFY or any other Imperial officer she recognized. "Allied Fleet Command, this is Admiral Mordak of the Zephyrian Colonial Defense Force. I am requesting permission to join your formation with 43 vessels of the Outer Rim Fleet." The bridge fell silent. A Zephyrian admiral was asking to join the alliance fighting against his own empire. Sarah struggled to process the implications of this development. "Admiral Mordak," she finally managed, "perhaps you could explain your intentions. Are you representing the Empire in some capacity?" Mordak's forearms gestured in what Sarah recognized as a Zephyrian expression of contempt. "Commander Chen, I represent the colonial fleet, which consists of Zephyrians and other species who have chosen to make the Outer Rim territories our home. We have monitored the Empire's ultimatum and their subsequent military mobilization. We find their actions objectionable." Sarah's mind raced through the political implications. If a significant portion of the Zephyrian military was defecting to support the Alliance, it would represent a massive shift in galactic politics. "Admiral," she said carefully, "joining this alliance means fighting against your own people. Are you and your crews prepared for that?" Mordak's compound eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. "Commander, the beings under my command are not fighting for or against any particular species. We are fighting for the principle that civilization should be built on cooperation rather than domination. The Empire's current leadership has forgotten that principle." He gestured towards something off-screen, and the display shifted to show his flagship, a massive vessel that was clearly of Zephyrian design, but modified with technology from multiple species. Sarah could see weapon systems that appeared to be draconian in origin, shield generators that looked Andromedian, and communication arrays that resembled Nexus collective quantum transceivers. "The Outer Rim territories have always been different from the core worlds," Mordak continued. "Out here, survival depends on cooperation between species, not rigid hierarchies based on fear. My crews include Zephyrians, humans, Krellians, Andromedians, and representatives from a dozen other species. We fight together because we choose to live together." Sarah realized that this was even more significant than she had initially understood. The colonial fleet wasn't just defecting from the Empire, they were representing an entirely different vision of what Zephyrian civilization could become. "Admiral Mordak," she said, "on behalf of the Allied fleet, I welcome your ships to our formation. Your knowledge of Imperial tactics and technology will be invaluable." As the transmission ended, Sarah turned to her tactical officer. "Commander Hayes, what's our updated force projection?" Hayes studied his displays for a moment before responding.
Ma'am, with the Colonial Fleet addition, we now have 374 vessels versus the Empire's estimated 420. More importantly, Admiral Mordak's ships include some heavy cruisers and a command dreadnought that's almost as powerful as an Imperial flagship. The odds were still unfavorable, but they were no longer hopeless. More importantly, the political implications of this defection would resonate throughout the Empire. If the colonial fleet was willing to openly rebel against imperial authority, other military units might follow their example. Incoming priority transmission from Earth, Torres announced. The display shifted to show Admiral Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking officer in Earth's Defense Force. Sarah had served under Williams early in her career and respected her both as a tactician and as a leader who never asked others to take risks she wouldn't accept herself.
Commander Chen, Williams began without preamble.
The Earth Defense Force has mobilized every available vessel for immediate deployment to your location. We're looking at 68 ships, including our newest dreadnought, the UES Constitution. Estimated arrival time, 14 hours. Sarah felt a surge of relief. Earth's fleet was smaller than some other contributors to the Alliance, but human vessels were built for endurance and versatility. More importantly, their arrival would mean that humanity's homeworld was fully committed to this fight. Additionally, Williams continued, we've reached out to our contacts in the Independent Systems Alliance. 17 previously neutral worlds have agreed to contribute ships or support to the Allied fleet. They're small contributions individually, but they represent over 50 additional vessels. The implications were staggering. What had started as a crisis threatening humanity's place in galactic civilization was rapidly becoming a referendum on the entire structure of galactic governance. Species that had remained neutral for decades were choosing sides, and most were choosing to stand against the Empire. As Williams' transmission ended, Sarah found herself looking around the bridge at her crew. They were all young. Most of them had never been in a major space battle, and in less than 18 hours they would be facing the largest and most powerful fleet in known space. But she saw no fear in their faces, only determination and a quiet confidence that came from knowing they were fighting for something that mattered. Commander, her sensor officer called out. We're detecting some kind of massive energy buildup from the ethereal vessel. Sub-Commander Velnara is requesting a communication channel. The holographic display activated to show the ethereal officer, her translucent form pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that Sarah's computer translated as expressions of focused concentration. Commander Chen, Velnara said, my ship has completed calibration of our defensive matrix generator. However, our analysis of the incoming Imperial fleet suggests that conventional defensive strategies may not be sufficient. With your permission, I would like to propose an alternative tactical approach. Sarah leaned forward with interest. Ethereal technology was so advanced that their tactical suggestions often seemed like magic to other species. Please proceed, Sub-Commander. Rather than attempting to match the Imperial fleet in a direct engagement, we propose using our dimensional phase capabilities to create a series of tactical ambushes. The Harmony can generate localized space-time distortions that will allow Allied ships to appear and disappear from normal space at will. This would allow your fleet to engage Imperial vessels piecemeal, rather than facing their entire force simultaneously. Sarah's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. Instead of a single massive battle, they could fight a series of smaller engagements, using hit-and-run tactics to whittle down the Imperial fleet while avoiding their overwhelming firepower advantage. The disadvantage, Velnara continued, is that this approach would require unprecedented coordination between ships from different species operating under extreme combat conditions. The margin for error would be essentially zero. A single mistimed maneuver could result in Allied ships materializing inside asteroids or enemy vessels. Sarah looked around the bridge, seeing the same realization in her officers' faces that she felt herself. This plan could work, but it would require perfect execution from a fleet that had never fought together before. It was audacious, dangerous, and possibly their only chance for victory. Sub-Commander, she said finally, how long would you need to brief the fleet commanders on these tactics? 6 hours for basic instruction, 12 hours for proper training simulation, Velnara replied.
I recommend we begin immediately. Sarah nodded. Make it happen.
All fleet commanders are to report to the Harmony for tactical briefing and simulation training. We have 12 hours to learn how to fight a war that's never been fought before. As her communications officer began sending instructions to the Allied fleet, Sarah realized that they were about to attempt something that military historians would either call brilliant or insane. But as she watched the diverse collection of ships around them beginning to move into formation for the training exercises, she felt a spark of hope. The Zephyrian Empire was coming with overwhelming force, superior technology, and centuries of military tradition. But the Allied fleet had something the Empire had never faced. Dozens of species working together, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. And sometimes, Sarah reflected, choice was the most powerful force in the galaxy. In 12 hours, they would find out if that was enough. The first phase transition was like being turned inside out while falling through liquid lightning. Commander Sarah Chen gripped her command chair as the UES Defiant materialized from the dimensional fold created by the ethereal ship Harmony, emerging directly behind a Zephyrian heavy cruiser that had been advancing on the Krillian formation. Her gunners, trained in 12 hours of intensive simulation, had their weapons locked and ready before the transition was complete. "Fire!" Sarah commanded, and the Defiant's plasma batteries unleashed a devastating broadside into the enemy ship's unshielded rear section. The Zephyrian vessel, caught completely off guard by the surprise attack, shuddered as explosions cascaded along its hull. Around them, 17 other Allied ships materialized in perfect formation, each targeting a different Imperial vessel. The carefully planned ambush was working exactly as Sub-Commander Velnara had predicted. The Zephyrian ships, expecting a conventional fleet engagement, found themselves under attack from enemies that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. "Phase transition in 15 seconds, announced Lieutenant Torres from the communications console. Sarah watched her tactical display as the Zephyrian cruiser they had attacked began to turn toward them, its weapons systems coming online despite the damage it had sustained. "All ships, prepare for withdrawal," Sarah commanded over the fleet communications net. Around her, the Allied vessels began the delicate process of aligning themselves for another dimensional phase. Their movements coordinated by quantum entanglement communicators provided by the Nexus Collective.
The space around them suddenly filled with plasma fire as the Imperial ships realized what was happening and began targeting the Allied fleet.
But it was too late. The Harmony's dimensional generators activated, and Sarah felt the universe twist around them as they vanished back into phase space, leaving the damaged Zephyrian cruiser alone among its fellows. "Status report," Sarah called out as her ship completed the transition to the staging area, a pocket of folded space where the Allied fleet could regroup between attacks. "Direct hits on target 7-7 Alpha," reported her tactical officer. "Significant damage to their propulsion systems and secondary weapons arrays. Target is combat ineffective but not destroyed." Sarah nodded with satisfaction. The hit-and-run tactics were designed to cripple rather than destroy. Damaged ships required resources to repair and evacuate, drawing Imperial strength away from the main battle. More importantly, the psychological effect of facing an enemy that could appear anywhere at any time was beginning to show in the increasingly erratic Imperial formation patterns. "Commander," Torres called out, "we're receiving tactical updates from the other strike groups. Strike Group Beta just completed their attack on Imperial Formation 6. Strike Group Gamma is reporting successful engagement with the Imperial supply convoy. The battle had been raging for 3 hours, and the Allied strategy was proving more effective than even its designers had hoped. By dividing their fleet into small, highly mobile groups, they were forcing the Empire to spread their defenses across the entire star system. The Imperial advantage in firepower meant nothing when they couldn't bring it to bear on targets that refused to stay in one place long enough for a proper engagement. But Sarah knew that their tactical advantage was temporary. Admiral Zexahay was too experienced a commander to be caught off guard indefinitely. Eventually, he would adapt to their tactics and find a way to counter them. "Incoming priority communication from Admiral Mordak," Torres announced. The holographic display activated to show the Zephyrian defector aboard his flagship Liberation. Behind him, Sarah could see his mixed-species crew working with the precision that came from years of cooperation. His face, however, showed signs of strain. "Commander Chen," Morodak said, "our intelligence assets within the Imperial fleet report that Admiral Zexhay has identified the source of our dimensional advantages. He's planning a direct assault on the Harmony in an attempt to disrupt our phase space capabilities." Sarah felt her stomach clench. The Harmony was the linchpin of their entire strategy. Without the ethereal ship's dimensional generators, the Allied fleet would be forced into a conventional engagement where the Empire's numerical superiority would quickly prove decisive. "What's the tactical situation around the Harmony's position?" she asked. "The ethereal ship is currently protected by the Draconian formation and 3 Andromedian shield ships," Mordak replied. "But Zexay is committing 4 dreadnoughts to the assault, supported by 30 heavy cruisers. Even the Draconians can't stand against that kind of firepower for long. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. The Harmony couldn't move while maintaining the dimensional fields that allowed the Allied ships to phase in and out of normal space. That meant it was essentially a stationary target, protected only by whatever forces could be positioned around it. "Admiral," she said, "how long until the Imperial assault begins?" 18 minutes, Mordak replied grimly. Zexay is repositioning his forces now. Once he commits to the attack, our tactical advantage disappears. Sarah looked around her bridge, seeing the same realization in her officers' faces that she felt herself. They had one chance to prevent the Empire from destroying their most valuable asset, but it would require abandoning the hit-and-run tactics that had served them so well and committing to the kind of direct engagement they had been trying to avoid. "All Allied strike groups," she announced over the fleet communications net. "This is Admiral Chen. We're implementing Emergency Protocol 7. All ships are to converge on the Harmony's position for defensive action." This is not a drill. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the star system, Allied ships began emerging from phase space and accelerating toward the center of the system where the Harmony maintained its position. Sarah watched the tactical display as over 300 vessels from 14 different species formed up in defensive formations around the ethereal ship. "Commander," her tactical officer called out, "we're detecting massive energy signatures from the Imperial fleet. Admiral Zexay's dreadnoughts are powering up their primary weapons." Sarah activated the fleet-wide communication system. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. In 5 minutes, we're going to face the largest concentration of firepower in galactic history. Our job is simple. Protect the Harmony long enough for them to complete whatever they're working on. Every second we buy them might determine the outcome of this battle." She paused, looking out at the vast fleet arrayed around them. Ships from species that had been enemies a generation ago now flew in perfect formation, their crews united by shared purpose and mutual respect.
"We're not just fighting for our ships or our worlds," she continued.
"We're fighting for the idea that different species can choose to stand together as equals, that cooperation is stronger than domination, and that some principles are worth dying for. The Empire wants to teach the galaxy that loyalty is weakness. Today, we prove them wrong." As if summoned by her words, the Imperial assault fleet appeared on the horizon. 4 massive dreadnoughts surrounded by a constellation of heavy cruisers, their hulls gleaming with weapons that could sterilize planets. At their head flew the Dominion of Worlds, Admiral Zexay's flagship, its primary cannon already glowing with charged energy. "All ships," Sarah commanded, "assume defensive formation Alpha 7. Draconian vessels, you have point position. Andromedian shield ships, maximum power to deflector arrays. Krillian heavy cruisers, prepare for close quarters engagement." The Allied fleet responded with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. The Draconian warships, built for brutal close-range combat, moved to the front of the formation. Behind them, the crystalline hulls of Andromedan ships began glowing as their shield generators powered up to maximum output. The Krillian vessels, heavily armored and bristling with weapons, took positions where they could provide crossfire support. "Energy spike from the Imperial flagship," her sensor officer reported. "They're targeting the Harmony directly." Sarah watched in fascination and horror as the Dominion of Worlds fired its primary weapon, a focused beam of antimatter energy that could punch through planetary defense shields. The attack struck the Andromedian shield formation protecting the Harmony, and for a moment the entire area was engulfed in brilliant light as exotic energies interacted in ways that physics textbooks said shouldn't be possible. When the light faded, 2 Andromedian shield ships had been reduced to expanding clouds of plasma, but the Harmony remained intact, protected by whatever dimensional effects the ethereals were generating around their vessel. "Return fire!" Sarah commanded, and the Allied fleet responded with everything they had. Hundreds of ships opened fire simultaneously, their weapons creating a storm of energy that turned the space between the fleets into a maelstrom of destructive force. The Imperial dreadnoughts absorbed the punishment with the stoic endurance of vessels designed to slug it out with entire fleets. Their armor held against most attacks, and their point defense systems intercepted many of the missiles and plasma torpedoes launched at them. But the sheer volume of fire was beginning to tell. Hull breaches appeared along their flanks, and several heavy cruisers began falling back with significant damage. "Direct hit on Imperial heavy cruiser Sword of Empire," her tactical officer reported. "Target appears to be venting atmosphere and dropping out of formation." But the Empire was giving as good as it got. Sarah watched in horror as a Tauri destroyer took a direct hit from a dreadnought's main gun and simply disintegrated, its crew of 300 beings dying in an instant of blinding light.
A Krillian heavy cruiser, its armor finally overwhelmed by sustained fire, exploded in a chain reaction that took two nearby ships with it.
Casualty reports coming in from across the fleet, Torres announced, her voice tight with emotion. We've lost 14 ships so far, with 23 more reporting significant damage. Sarah forced herself to focus on the tactical situation, rather than the growing list of casualties. The Allied fleet was fighting with desperate courage, but they were being slowly ground down by the Empire's superior firepower. They needed something to change the balance of the engagement, or they would be overwhelmed within the hour. As if in answer to her thoughts, the communication array activated with a priority message from Subcommander Velnara aboard the Harmony. Admiral Chen, the ethereal officer, said, her translucent form pulsing with patterns of light that Sarah's computer indicated represented extreme urgency. My ship has completed preparations for what your military might call a strategic escalation. We are prepared to demonstrate why the ethereal dominion has remained neutral in galactic conflicts for 5,000 years. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had always wondered why a species with such advanced technology chose to avoid military involvement in galactic affairs. She was about to find out. Subcommander, she said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? Admiral, our defensive matrix generator can be reconfigured to create offensive applications. Instead of generating protective barriers around your ships, we can create localized space-time distortions around enemy vessels. The effects would be significant. Sarah's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. If the ethereals could manipulate space-time around enemy ships, they could potentially disable or destroy entire fleets without firing a single conventional weapon. What are the risks? She asked. Velnara's form pulsed with what the computer translated as uncertainty. The primary risk is to the fabric of local space-time. Excessive use of these weapons could create permanent dimensional instabilities in this star system. Additionally, deploying such weapons would represent a fundamental shift in galactic military balance. The other major powers would likely feel compelled to develop countermeasures, leading to an escalation spiral that could destabilize the entire galaxy. Sarah looked around her bridge, then at the tactical display showing the Allied fleet being slowly decimated by Imperial fire. They were facing annihilation, but accepting ethereal assistance would fundamentally change the nature of galactic warfare. Before she could respond, Admiral Mordak's voice crackled across the communication net. Admiral Chen, Imperial reinforcements just dropped out of hyperspace at the system perimeter. Admiral Zexai called for backup. We're looking at an additional 150 vessels inbound. Without immediate action, the Allied fleet will be completely overwhelmed. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, weighing the immediate necessity against the long-term consequences. When she opened them, her expression was set with grim determination. Subcommander Velnara, she said, deploy your weapons. Target the Imperial flagship and its escort dreadnoughts. We'll deal with the political consequences later, assuming any of us survive to face them. The Harmony's crystalline hull began to pulse with energies that seemed to exist in more dimensions than normal space could contain. Around the ethereal ship, reality itself began to bend and twist as forces beyond conventional understanding were brought to bear on the battlefield. The effect on the Imperial dreadnoughts was immediate and terrifying. The massive vessels began to stretch. As local space-time warped around them, their hulls twisted into impossible geometries. Their weapon systems failed as the fundamental constants of physics became variable, and their crews found themselves experiencing time at different rates depending on their position within the ships. Within minutes, 4 of the most powerful warships in galactic history had been reduced to helpless hulks drifting through space, their crews evacuating in whatever escape pods still functioned normally. The psychological effect on the remaining Imperial fleet was even more dramatic than the physical destruction. Ships that had been pressing their attacks moments before began falling back in obvious panic, their commanders faced with weapons that operated outside their understanding of how warfare worked. But Sarah's satisfaction was short-lived. As the immediate threat to the Harmony receded, she realized that they had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The genie was out of the bottle, and the galaxy would never be the same. The battle was far from over, but its character had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a conflict over humanity's place in galactic civilization had become something much larger, a demonstration that the old certainties about power and dominance were no longer valid. As reinforcements from both sides continued to arrive in the system, Sarah realized that they were no longer just fighting for Andromeda Prime, they were fighting for the future of the galaxy itself. The silence in the aftermath of battle was more profound than the chaos that had preceded it. Commander Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant, watching through the viewport as rescue ships from a dozen species moved through the debris field that had once been the pride of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy. The space around Andromeda Prime was littered with the wreckage of over 200 vessels. But for the first time in galactic history, those vessels belonged primarily to the Empire rather than their enemies. The turning point had come not from the ethereal superweapons, devastating as they were, but from something far more unexpected: mass defection within the Imperial fleet itself. When Admiral Zexhai's reinforcements arrived and witnessed their flagship dreadnoughts being twisted into impossible shapes by forces they couldn't comprehend, nearly a third of the Imperial fleet had simply stopped fighting. Some ships had powered down their weapons and requested sanctuary. Others had turned their guns on their former allies. The unity of purpose that had made the Empire seemingly invincible for 1,000 years had shattered in the space of a few hours. "Final casualty reports, Admiral," Lieutenant Torres said quietly, her voice hoarse from coordinating rescue operations for the past 6 hours. Sarah had noticed that her crew had started calling her Admiral without any official promotion, a recognition of her role in coordinating the largest multi-species military operation in galactic history. Sarah accepted the datapad with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. The Allied casualties were significant: 47 ships destroyed, over 12,000 dead, nearly 30,000 wounded. But the Imperial losses were staggering: over 180 ships destroyed or captured, an estimated 250,000 casualties, and most importantly, the complete collapse of Imperial authority over half their tributary worlds. "Admiral," her communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the remaining Imperial fleet. Admiral Zexhai is requesting a ceasefire and negotiations." Sarah looked up in surprise. The Empire had never negotiated with enemies before. They either conquered or were conquered, with no middle ground. For Admiral Zexhai to request talks represented a fundamental admission that the old ways of conducting galactic politics were no longer viable. "Put him through," she said, straightening her uniform and trying to project more confidence than she felt. She was about to negotiate with one of the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy, and she was acutely aware that her decisions in the next few minutes could determine whether this conflict ended or escalated into a galaxy-wide war. The holographic display activated to show Admiral Zexhai aboard what remained of his flagship. The massive Zephyrian looked nothing like the confident, domineering figure who had delivered ultimatums to the Galactic Council just days earlier. His chitinous exoskeleton was cracked in several places. His uniform was stained with what Sarah hoped was hydraulic fluid rather than blood, and his compound eyes reflected something she had never expected to see in a Zephyrian commander: uncertainty. "Commander Chen," he said, his harmonics carrying none of their former authority, "I am prepared to discuss terms for the cessation of hostilities." Sarah noticed that he hadn't called her Admiral, despite the obvious recognition of her leadership role by everyone else in the system. Some habits apparently died hard. "Admiral Zexhai," she replied, emphasizing his title while not claiming one for herself. "I'm prepared to listen to your proposals. However, I should inform you that any agreement will need to be ratified by all the allied species. This isn't a bilateral negotiation. It's a discussion between the Empire and a coalition of sovereign worlds." Zexhai's mandibles clicked with what Sarah recognized as frustration. "Commander, you must understand that the Empire cannot simply reverse a millennium of established galactic order. There are protocols, hierarchies, expectations that have maintained peace and stability across hundreds of worlds." "Admiral," Sarah said quietly, "with respect, those protocols and hierarchies led directly to this battle. The Empire's demand that allied species abandon their human partners created this crisis. If you want to prevent future conflicts, you need to accept that some things are going to change." Before Zexhai could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "Perhaps I might offer some perspective on this matter." Both Sarah and Zexhai turned in surprise as Ambassador Corinth of the Ethereal Dominion materialized in the holographic display. The Ethereal's translucent form was pulsing with the slow, steady rhythms that indicated deep contemplation. "Ambassador Corinth," Zexhai said, his voice carefully neutral. "Even Imperial commanders didn't casually antagonize beings who could twist dreadnoughts into pretzels with a thought." "Admiral Zexhai, Commander Chen," Corinth said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. "The Ethereal Dominion has observed this conflict with great interest. For 5,000 years we have maintained neutrality in galactic affairs, intervening only when fundamental principles were at stake.
Today, we chose to act because we recognized something unprecedented. A conflict where one side was fighting not for conquest or resources, but for the right to maintain relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. Corinth's form shifted colors as they continued. The deployment of our strategic weapons in this battle represents a significant shift in our policy. We did so not to guarantee victory for any particular faction, but to prevent the destruction of something valuable, a model of interspecies cooperation that could serve as a foundation for a more stable galactic civilization. Sarah felt the weight of the ethereal's words. The most advanced species in the galaxy had essentially endorsed the Allied Coalition's approach to interspecies relations. That endorsement carried implications that would resonate throughout galactic politics for generations. "Ambassador," she said carefully, "are you speaking for the entire Dominion?"
I am, Corinth replied.
The Council of Transcendence has voted unanimously to support the establishment of formal diplomatic recognition for what we are calling the Alliance of Sovereign Worlds, a coalition of species committed to cooperation based on mutual respect rather than dominance hierarchies. The implications were staggering. With ethereal backing, the Allied coalition could become a legitimate political entity capable of standing as equals with the Empire. They would no longer be rebels fighting for survival. They would be a recognized government with the backing of the galaxy's most powerful species. Admiral Zexai's compound eyes seemed to dim as he processed this development. "Ambassador, if the Dominion recognizes this alliance as a legitimate political entity, it fundamentally alters the balance of galactic power. The Empire cannot simply ignore such a development." "Nor should it," Corinth replied. "Admiral, the Empire's strength has always come from its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. For 1,000 years, your hierarchical system provided stability and order when the galaxy needed those things. But circumstances have changed. The discovery of extragalactic threats, the development of species-transcendent technologies, the emergence of truly cooperative interspecies relationships, these developments require new approaches to governance and diplomacy." Sarah watched Zexai's face as the ethereal spoke. She could see the internal struggle playing out behind his compound eyes. A lifetime of imperial conditioning warring with the pragmatic recognition that the galaxy had changed irrevocably. "What exactly are you proposing?" the Admiral asked finally. "A new model of galactic governance," Corinth said. "Not the replacement of the Empire, but its evolution. The Empire remains sovereign over worlds that choose imperial governance. The Alliance governs worlds that prefer cooperative models. Both entities recognize each other's legitimacy and work together to address challenges that affect the galaxy as a whole." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. This wasn't just an end to the current conflict. It was a complete restructuring of galactic civilization. For the first time in a millennium, there would be an alternative to imperial dominance. "And humanity's place in this new order?" she asked. "Humanity would hold the same status as any other species within the Alliance," Corinth replied. "No special privileges, but also no special restrictions. Your species' unique talent for building trust-based relationships with other species would likely make you valuable mediators and diplomats, but your political standing would be based on merit rather than species affiliation." Sarah looked around her bridge, seeing the hope beginning to grow in her officers' faces. This was everything they had fought for. Not dominance over other species, but simple equality and recognition. Admiral Zexai was silent for several minutes, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the implications of the proposed arrangement. Finally, he spoke. "Commander Chen, I must consult with the Imperial Council before committing to any formal agreements. However, I am prepared to implement an immediate ceasefire and begin preliminary negotiations. The Empire acknowledges that the current situation requires significant adjustments to established protocols." Sarah nodded, recognizing the massive concession inherent in that statement. For a Zephyrian admiral to acknowledge that established protocols needed adjustment was equivalent to admitting that the entire Imperial worldview might be flawed. "Admiral," she said, "the Alliance is prepared to begin negotiations immediately. However, I think it would be appropriate for those negotiations to take place under neutral mediation. The Ethereal Dominion would be honored to serve as mediators," Corinth offered. "Our homeworld has facilities designed to accommodate representatives from all known species." As the preliminary arrangements for negotiations began to take shape, Sarah found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. It had started with an imperial ultimatum designed to isolate humanity and demonstrate the futility of opposing imperial will. Instead, it had revealed the existence of bonds between species that were stronger than fear
creating a coalition that could stand as equals with the most powerful empire in galactic history. "Admiral Chen," came a new voice over the communications net. Sarah turned to see Prime Minister Lysandra appearing on the holographic display, her silver skin gleaming with exhaustion but her violet eyes bright with satisfaction. "Prime Minister," Sarah replied, "I hope you're calling with good news from the surface." "The planetary shields held," Lysandra confirmed. "Minimal civilian casualties and our industrial infrastructures intact. More importantly, we've received formal diplomatic communications from 47 worlds requesting information about joining the Alliance. Word of this battle is spreading throughout the galaxy faster than we anticipated." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. The message was clear. Species throughout the galaxy were no longer willing to accept Imperial dominance as inevitable. The example set by the Allied coalition had inspired others to seek alternatives. "There's something else," Lysandra continued. "We've been monitoring communications from Imperial worlds, and we're seeing signs of significant political instability. Several Imperial governors have declared independence from central authority. The Empire's tributary worlds are reassessing their relationships with the central government." The implications were enormous. The Empire's defeat at Andromeda Prime wasn't just a military loss. It was a crack in the foundation of Imperial authority that was spreading throughout their territory. The galaxy,